Hi, welcome colleagues and friends of the International Association of Autistic Studies. I am Fernando Soler. I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Theology of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. In this interview, or series of interviews to meet and thanks those who have dedicated their life to autistic studies, collaborating decisively with our association, I am pleased to introduce Professor Theodore de Bruyn. He's an emeritus professor in religious studies at the University of Ottawa and a well-known scholar. We will have this interview to hear from him about his research, but let me say a word about his topics. He has translated Pelagius and Ambrosiaster commentaries on Paul's letters to Romans into English and studied the interaction between institutional forms of Christianity and the production of amulets in late antique Egypt. More recently, he is focused on the study of identity in early Christianity, especially studying how Christians responded to challenge and crisis and interact with the religious system in which they participated. Well, as has been the nature of these interviews, today we want to put aside his scientific productivity and get to know him. We are interested in learning who this man is, Professor Theodore de Bruyn, who has dedicated his life to early Christianity, giving us great fruits, which together with his person, we are grateful, and we are conducting this interview to thank him. The member of our association must know this already, but Professor de Bruyn has been our president for 2 terms and also vice president once. To him, we also have to thank the organization of our website. Well, Professor, my first question is, when and why did you decide to dedicate yourself to the study of early Christianity?
It's a nice question to ask. It led me to try and remember all of these things. Dedicate might be a bit strong at the time when I made these decisions, but I should give a bit of background because it explains how it emerged. I was raised in the Dutch Reformed tradition. I was born in the Netherlands. My family emigrated to Canada, and we were raised in what broadly is called the Calvinist or Reformed tradition. And when I began to study theology seriously at the level of a master's degree, I did that in a Reformed theological school, which therefore influenced and shaped a lot of what I was studying from a Reformed perspective. And it was a fairly classical education. It was a thorough education, but it also, by the end of it, seemed like I had spent too much of my life in the Reformed tradition, both because I was raised in it and now because I had studied it. And there was a certain frustration with, I think, a degree of dogmatism that I experienced, at least at that level of education. So I went looking elsewhere, and perhaps because the reformers themselves turned to the early Christian period, but also I think because the early Christian period was one that was so still, as it were, inchoate, in development, less formed in some ways. I think that was a naive impression at the time than what I experienced in the Reformed, as it were, the period of the Reformation and the Reformed tradition. I decided to go into the period of early Christianity. But another reason I did this was while I was doing my master's, I became interested or fascinated with the actual process of translation. And I'll get to that later when in this interview, but I began to translate some texts, I think, from Latin into English. And I became interested in that very process as a way of understanding a culture. And the opportunity to study early Christianity would allow me to continue with that. Now, there are other periods which I could have done that in. There's a long tradition of course, the use of Latin in the Western in Western culture and society. But in the end, because of certain options that opened for me and some doors that closed, it ended up being the field of early Christianity where I continued with that pursuit. So it was more, in a way, not by mistake, but it was not necessarily by design, but it it was a series of, as it were, coming to awarenesses on my part that led me to start to work in the early Christian field at the level of my doctorate.
Thank you. Very interesting, Professor. Thank you. And on what subject have you focused your research?
Well, you've mentioned some of them, of course. In fact, all of them in the introduction to this interview. My initial project, which I settled on while I was in the course of my doctorate. I didn't realize this when I started the doctorate. I settled on it actually about halfway through, was to write a translation with extensive notes and an introduction of Pelagius's commentary on Romans. And I mean, it doesn't take much to realize that the issues that Pelagius, or that emerged in the subsequent Pelagian controversy, were ones that I probably would have been familiar out of my background. But what attracted me, I think, to Pelagius, especially to Pelagius's Pauline commentaries, was I really was interested in understanding the position of thinkers in the early Christian world, especially those that became controversial or were named heretical before they were, as were thought to be controversial, and for quote unquote, for lack of better words, on their own terms. I wanted to understand Pelagius on terms of his own, and the Pauline commentaries were in fact written before Pelagius became, and Caelestius and others became embroiled in what we now call the Pelagian controversy. And this is in some sense, to go back to the first question you asked, was a reaction to what I felt was an ahistorical approach to Christian theology and the development of Christian traditions. I wanted to understand Pelagius in the context in which he was flourishing, and in his interaction with the Pauline letters, and particularly the letter to the Romans. And that indirectly led about 10 years later, 12 years later, to my taking up the translation of Ambrosiaster's commentary. I wasn't really planning to return to the study of Latin Pauline commentaries, but I was approached by David Hunter at the time, and my circumstances were such that it would be easier for me to do translation than it would be to do other things in the time that I had available to me. So, and somewhat reluctantly, I resumed translation of Romans commentaries, and that was very fruitful, because even more than with Pelagius, in Ambrosiaster, you have someone who really is seeking to come to understand the text, a text that is puzzling to him. If Ambrosiaster, we assume, is a man, it's a text that was puzzling, and it's interesting to see how he comes to his own unique interpretations of that text. So that's the one stream of research that I have been involved in. Between the two translations, though, I became interested in the violence in early Christian discourse. I didn't pursue that very far, but I had spent quite a bit of time reading Augustine's sermons, partly because for someone who wants to solidify for one who wanted to solidify his knowledge of Latin, the sermons are easy they help you do that. So I'd read through a lot of the sermons, and I became aware of how coercive, in some ways, the discourse of Augustine and others. It's not, I don't think Augustine is unique. Augustine's just very persuasive. How in some dimensions his discourse can be coercive. And you can find that in other authors as well. So I actually explored that in a number of studies. I did not pursue that further, in part because I didn't feel like I don't think I'd had the theoretical framework that at the time that would have allowed me to pursue it well. But it did inform my understanding of how discourse operates, particularly within Christian communities. So that was the second thing I turned to. You see, I move along I don't do the same thing over and over again. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But it was thanks to Augustine that I actually ended up working on amulets, or at least working on them in the way that I did, because I gave a short presentation on a sermon of Augustine when I was visiting in Australia at the time. And it includes his description of people who use amulets. And someone came up to me after the convener, Jeff Jenkins, came up to me afterwards and said, you know, we have lots of these. And of course, and I didn't know that. I am ashamed to say, but I didn't. So I began looking at them. And then by happenstance, I read one amulet that was edited by a papyrologist, a very good edition and a very noteworthy papyrologist. But what that papyrologist didn't notice, but I was convinced of, was that the amulet consisted in a baptismal formula. It was actually a pre-baptismal formula. And suddenly I began to think about how two things. I became interested in the practices of Christians to the extent that we can get to them more closely than through the discourse or the language or the instruction of writers and authorities. And secondly, how that practice actually was interacted with what we know about the institutional practices of the church at the time. And Egypt affords an excellent, as it were, laboratory for that, because so many papyri have survived. So that led to the actual careful study of amulets as written mainly in Greek, in my case, on papyrus and parchment, and the book that I wrote on the Christianization, for lack of a better word, of the formulations on these amulets. And it was a very satisfying, I'd say, decade, 12 years of my life, because of the working with material culture, but also because of the greater understanding I got of the interaction and the relationships between practice as we know it and institutional cultures. So that was, I think, project number 3 or stream number 3. And then I should wrap this up. I'd worked then, I suppose, in the Latin West. I'd worked in Egypt, and I wanted to go elsewhere. I wanted to go further east if I could. And my, excuse me, my familiarity with Ambrosiaster, of course, made me aware of the so-called genre, or at least the form of question and answers. And as I rummaged around, I became familiar with the collections, in particular of Barsanuphi St. John, the monks in Gaza in the 500s, and I ended up exploring, and I have been reading those letters and other literature to try and understand, as you mentioned, identity formation, particularly the formation of identity of individuals in relation to all the events or crises that they may be experiencing, whether they're monks or whether they're laity, or in fact clergy, and all three are represented in that collection. So that's what I'm working on now, as well as that literature and its insights into how people perceive what we know of the crises of the 6th and 7th centuries in the Eastern Roman Empire.
Well, thank you. That's it's a quite interesting story about your study. Thank you very much. Now I want to know, who were the teacher who influenced your education the most? Can you say something about that, about people? You have mentioned some names, but it's interesting to hear from you.
I'd be happy to, and it's a nice way to acknowledge them. Many of them are no longer living. In fact, I don't think any of them are, but I'm still, I'm happy to acknowledge them. And I'd also like to speak, though, a little bit about the environments that I think were important and what nurtured me in my studies. If I go to teachers, I have to go back to my undergraduate degree. I did not start to learn Latin or Greek until I was in my undergraduate degree. I did a major in English literature. And but I had a very, I guess, a typical classics professor, sort of the one with the beady eyes and the beard and the round glasses, and fairly austere and stern. But he was generous in supporting students that he saw had an interest in Latin and Greek. And I, with a number of others, he took aside and basically enriched our program beyond what it would have been in large classes or classes of Latin and Greek language, or even reading Latin and Greek texts. And I think if I had not had that kind of tutelage at that time, I wouldn't have gotten an interest, of course, in the language, nor would I have actually advanced far enough to do much more with them. And then that led to the second teacher, who was I think a real mentor in his personality, but also in his approach to his work. this was a visiting professor at when I was in my master's program at Calvin Theological Seminary, Ford Lewis Battles, who had translated Calvin's Institutes for the series, The Library of Christian Classics. He had an interesting personality. He too actually was very generous in taking on students that he saw had an interest in translation. And I would not have been able to continue with Latin if he hadn't agreed to tutor me. I was then carrying on with Greek and learning Hebrew, as one did in a classical training at the time. But it was he that actually introduced me to the process of translation, and I got hooked on it, thanks to his personality and his generosity. From there, I went to the University of Toronto, and in particular to the University of St. Michael's College, where I did my my doctorate. But I did the doctorate in the at the University of St. Michael's College. There's also a medieval institute, the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies. And when I was doing my doctorate, I decided to take paleography, Latin paleography, and I actually did eventually a directed study in textual editing. And my teacher in both of those courses was Leonard Boyle, whom a specialist Aquinist, eventually the prefect of the Vatican Library. And again, he was a very generous instructor. In paleography, I was in a large class, but he communicated to those students. He's a very, very charismatic instructor. Communicated to those students both, in interest in paleography, an appropriate attitude toward the text. He didn't. He did not suffer arrogance well. He was an Irish Dominican and could be critical of arrogant editors. So I think I came to appreciate what one could learn from manuscripts and from editions. And he also kindly gave me a directed study in textual editing. So this ended up, I think, either helping me or directing me when I started to work on Pelagius and Ambrosiaster, because both those commentaries have a complex manuscript transmission, and I ended up having to deal with that and work on it and learn from it in those projects. And then finally, I have to mention my doctoral supervisor, Joanne McWilliam, whose influence was quite different. She, and it's interesting to think about this, she left me a lot of independence. I had a lot of freedom in my doctoral program, and even when I was writing the dissertation, she was very acute in her observations, whether we was in conversation or in writing. But she really let me work on my own. Now, whether that was just her habit or whether that was her perception of how I would work, I don't know. But it did mean that I developed as perhaps I wanted to in my program, and I'm always grateful for that. I felt like I was, in some sense, given the latitude to explore what I wanted to explore in my doctoral program. So I'm grateful to her for that. But I mentioned I also wanted to speak briefly about environments, because I'm very much aware that in all these places and beyond, it wasn't just the teachers, it was the whole context. To begin with, I mean, I was shaped by the kind of classical formation I had in both my liberal arts undergraduate degree and in my master's degree in historical theology. But I deliberately chose, having grown up in that environment, to go to quite a different environment. I deliberately chose to go to a Roman Catholic school for my doctoral work, and to an ecumenical, as it were, institution, because in the University of Toronto at the time, theological studies was in fact a collective effort of about 7 theological colleges, all of which had, of course, traditions in individual Christian denominations. And St. Michael's College had a very rich sort of collection of scholars of early Christianity, about half a dozen. So I went there for that, and because I wanted actually to move out of the environment I was familiar with into another environment. So that was, and I had very collegial, as it were, colleagues among my students in classes in that program. But I also benefited from the presence of medievalists. And in fact, I was really fortunate in that there was a common room in the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies where all the graduate students hung out, and some of the faculty as well. So I hung out with them. So I had lunch, tea, coffee, and so on there. In many ways, the PhD was the happiest degree that I ever took because I had such a supportive community. But it also introduced me to a lot of medievalia and reinforced, in some sense, the interest in certain things that medievalists often focus on, which is our texts and editing. And then from there, I guess the final environment is not one that was in my, as it were, program of studies. By circumstances, I had a very nice initial appointment at the Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, and I stayed there for 5 years, but my partner lives in Ottawa, so I moved to Ottawa. And at that point, there were no jobs in the university. So I decided to, as it were, retool and look for work elsewhere. And in that process, I did a graduate diploma in public policy. And I eventually ended up working for the federal government of Canada, and for a short while, and then for about a decade on my own as a researcher and writer in health policy with a focus on HIV and human rights. And that whole process, the program, the graduate program I did, introduced me to many of the social sciences and to the way in which the social sciences use theory and models and data to try and explain human behavior. And that was something that was missing in my prior formation. And then my subsequent work led me to realize this shows you some of the limitations of my formation. Led me to realize that there are very, very, very capable people working outside of the university in government, in nonprofit organizations as activists. I met people across the country, and they're very dedicated. They're very effective. They did a lot with whatever resources they had. I came to admire the people that I met outside of the university in a way that I would never actually been able to had I had always been in the university. So that environment has shaped me as well, indirectly, particularly, of course, when it comes to research, but also in my sense of the importance of, or the relative importance of what we do in our own fields.
Thank you, Professor. It's very nice to hear about generosity, about context, about community, because, of course, also our task with ancient Christianity is about generosity, the formation of new generation. And I'm glad to mention this generosity, because my next question is shaped also by your own generosity. I have mentioned that you were our president 2 times and also vice president, and you helped to set up our web page. How and when your participation in IAEP or association begin?
I had to look that up because I remember that I was invited at some point to become a member of the association by Kevin Coyle, who for many years was the national correspondent for the association in Canada and lived in Ottawa as I do. And I found myself listed in the annuaire of 1992. So sometime then, and that makes about, that's about right. I think about that point, I'd published a few articles, and the book that I was hoping to publish was probably accepted at that point. So at 1992, I was listed as a member of the association. And then the next, as it were, significant interaction was in 2004, when Michael Schlusser, who was then the secretary of the association, invited me to become the national correspondent for Canada. So I assumed that role. It was not a large role. We have, maybe 20 members at the time. I forget exactly, but it's a crucial role, because otherwise the association can seem fairly remote from, people in various regions. And we're such a diverse set of people, so that it's good to have national correspondents. In any event, I became the national correspondent. And then in 2007, I was approached about joining the executive, and I thought about it. And because of, by that point, I had been hired by the University of Ottawa, and I was working fairly hard in that job. I thought the only thing I can undertake would be to be a vice president. And it was actually, I think it was wise, because the more onerous roles of the association were filled by three very capable people. Carol Harrison, of course, as president, Samuel Rubinson as treasurer, and he had already assumed those duties earlier, and Lorenzo Perrone as secretary. So it was a very nice apprenticeship. And Ben Morgan was also a vice president at the time. So there's a lot of collective history on that executive, and I think learned a lot about the association simply by being in the executive with those others around me. And it was also, I should mention, maybe just as an aside, it was a very nice way of becoming much more familiar with European scholars. I'd always used European scholarship already in my master's program. I remember using the work of AIEP-IAPS, for example, but I had not met many European scholars except at the Oxford conferences, which are relatively infrequent. So it was very nice to gradually become more familiar with European scholars and scholarship, and to do that in successive terms as well. I was not looking to become president of the association, and I never thought I would be president for 2 terms. I think it made sense in the first term because it provided a certain amount of continuity, because we were, as you mentioned, at that point, making our way into the digital age. I think the present executive has brought that much further. The fact that we're having this interview on YouTube is not something I anticipated in what was it, 2007, and not even in 2011 or even in 2015, which are the various points of the beginnings of my terms of duties. But it's a good thing, and but it was a long process, and it actually that was right. We are dealing with multiple generations of people. It takes time for us to learn how to do these things, and it's also costly. It takes resources in finances as well. So it was good to take our time about it, but it's good that it also happened. So that briefly is sort of the various stages of my involvement. But I would say, you mentioned the website, and that's the one thing that I think was my contribution with insight and from others on the executive, was my contribution when I was a vice president. And it was actually it was a nice thing to do. As a vice president, I thought it would be good to have a project. And other vice presidents have also had projects in their own term. When I was president the second time, Lenka Karikova and Patricia Siner both really reached out extensively to their to the areas of the world they knew well, and that I think reinforced our presence in South and Central America and Eastern Europe. So but I did not have that opportunity. It wasn't really what I was thinking of. So it was nice to be able to work on the website and to see that into fruition.
Thank you very much. Now, a more personal question. How do you think the study of ancient Christianity has influenced your life?
Yes, that is an interesting question. It's probably the most difficult one that you're asking me. I'm a bit pessimistic in this, or at least I'm fairly reserved in what I think you can take from the ancient world as guidance for the contemporary world. But I think there are things that I have learned through my studies. There are obvious things, strangely enough, but they're only things you become really aware of, I think, when you study a culture deeply. In some ways, I'm not extensively, but I've studied parts of this culture deeply. And I'd say one of the things I become so acutely aware of is the contingency of so much that emerges in a culture, in a society, in a tradition, or a series of traditions. There's always a tendency, I think there's a tendency in historiography, and probably in the history of Christianity as well, to take what's known as a teleological approach, to sort of say that it was all meant to end up there, but that's not the case. It could have ended up in many different ways, and didn't end up in different ways. And I think the study of history helps you to realize that. And I'm aware of that. We are in the same predicament. We don't necessarily know where things that we are experiencing today will end. And the dilemmas we face in some ways are similar to the dilemmas that we can see if in the ancient world, even if the ancients didn't necessarily see them themselves. I suppose one of the reasons I have sort of a kind of not a conflicted, but an ambivalent relationship with the ancient world is that and it's a bit of kind of like when you grow up from a child to an adult, you realize that you're more like your parents than you'd like to be. It's in the ancient world had significant, I think, social limitations. It was stratified. There was it was violent. It was colonialist. It was there was an inequitable distribution of wealth, an extraordinary inequitable distribution of wealth. That's not unique to the ancient Roman world or the Mediterranean world, but it was true of it. And there were very restrictive, as it were, perceptions of people, whether on ethnicity or gender or other kinds of qualities, status, free, slave, or freed. And we're not free of those very limitations. I'll be honest, I would prefer to be living in Canada now than in the Roman Empire then, but it's not as if I'm unaware of similar kinds of social, structural, social and structural, as it were, limitations in my own society, my own environment. So you can see them in antiquity, and I think you need to see them in antiquity. There's no point in being superior about it all, because we're not necessarily that much more perceptive, even if we have made, I think, gains in some ways. We have our own deficiencies and challenges. So that's fairly pessimistic, but I'm afraid that if I look for inspiration for I mean the future, for our futures, for futures of peoples, I have to say I look more to my period when I worked in public policy and when I saw what both people in government and outside of government can do to try and address an issue than I am about what we can learn from antiquity. But this is the intriguing thing about all of this. I did work in a lot of literature, scientific literature, when I was a consultant in health policy. And it never interested me. It didn't, as we say in English, it didn't turn my crank. It didn't, as it were, captivate me the way the study of antiquity does. So even though I am not one who says I really, as it were, have been shaped by the study of antiquity, I can't leave it alone either. I mean, it's a choice. It really is a choice. And in some sense, I like investigating it, even if it's challenging, even if it's puzzling, even if it's in some sense dismaying. It's not all pretty, but it still is something that I find inherently fascinating. So if you want to end on a positive note, I don't want to leave my people who watch this just too discouraged. It is endlessly fascinating, and I don't regret, as it were, all the hours I've spent in research on this field at all.
Thank you for your honest answer. my final question, that really are two questions, is what advice would you give to new generation of autistic scholars, and also what challenge do you see for our association?
I'll start with the first, of course. I'm a bit hesitant here because everybody is in a different situation, both personally and in their immediate society, but also in their country or their region. What's available to people varies so much, and where people start is so different. So in a way, what I'm going to say is reflects where I started and where I've gone, but it might not be the right thing for someone who starts somewhere else. But what I would still say this is going to be fairly prosaic or pragmatic. The first thing I would say is learn as many ancient and modern languages as you can, because they open doors to many, many, many different possibilities in research and in collaboration. I mean, I would say it doesn't all have to happen at once. It can't happen all at once, especially depending on how fortunate you are in, or unfortunate you are in, what you've been able to learn by the time you come to the studies. But you need a lot of modern languages, and you need a lot of ancient languages. And the more of those you have, the more you're able to do, the more that becomes possible to you, if you happen to become interested in something or in some group of scholars. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is, if this pertains particularly to the ancient languages, I don't recommend that people necessarily do translations as part of their, as it were, scholarly publications, but I do think it's good to translate a text in order to solidify your knowledge of the ancient language you want to work in, because you realize how many choices you're making when you're translating the text, and then you can understand the choices that other people make. You can also understand the choices that might have been made for you by the editor of the edition of the text. So I think that's a good exercise, whether or not you end up translating as a way of doing your scholarship. The third thing I would say is, and this is probably the hardest thing, I don't know whether I succeeded in doing this, but if you can see something that is beyond your horizon, whether it's your social horizon, whether it's your religious tradition, whether it's the tradition of scholarship you've been raised in, whether it's a field of as a research, if you get a sense of that being beyond what you are accustomed to, try and explore that. Now, again, you can't do all of that, but if you can see that and realize, oh, that would actually introduce me to something that will force me to think about things in a different way, then I think that's a good thing to do. And that can be at every level. It can be in the area of study in late antiquity. It can be in the linguistic culture. It can be in contemporary theory, various theories. It can be in approaches to the field. There are so many ways in which that can happen for people. But if you can sense that, take advantage of that and use that. And I suppose the last thing I would say is, I think it's always good to, as it were, explore theory and method that might be relevant for your topic. And when you do, to try and understand that theory and method well. I'm not one who likes to write a lot of theoretical work in my research. I don't think that's my strength. It's not something that I really relish doing. But I do think that when one uses theory from other fields, and I have in my research, it's important to become really well versed in it. And I think it does open up new ways of seeing things, and possibly new ways of explaining things. So that's one thing that I would encourage people to do. But as I say, everybody starts in a different place or in their own place, and that's important for people to remember.
Thank you. And what about the challenge to our association?
I suppose the challenges we face are the ones that our world faces. We will need to keep pace with what happens by way of global communication and the possibilities of global communication, and what that means for the association, and how it sustains its membership and supports its membership in the coming years, if not decades. I think we've made steps there, but the world won't stay still. Probably a website is probably the most old-fashioned and static and non-dynamic type of a way of presenting yourself in our world of contemporary media than that we can think of. So it's almost like a book at this point. So that will be an ongoing challenge, I think, for the association and for the executive of the association. And I think the second challenge, I think, is again one that's probably always been with the association, but in some sense I hope will grow, and that is that as the association embraces more and more scholars from around the world, I think it will have to understand what that means for itself as an association, for the field of studies, and for the diversity of the field of studies. Now, I became aware of that, I suppose, especially when people presented at the conference that Carol Harrison, Broya Bitonashkoloni, and I organized in 2013 to recognize the 50th anniversary of the association, because people there spoke about patristics in various parts of the world. Now, those are particular visions or particular perceptions. It's not universal and comprehensive, but I became aware of how different patristics can be or the study of ancient Christianity can be in different parts of the world and in different contexts. And one can only hope that increases, that in other words, that more and more people work with this field of study because it sustains the field of study, but at the same time, one has to recognize that diversity and include it and respect it. So that, I think, will be, it's not a challenge for the executive of the association, it's a challenge for the field in that sense. And to the extent that the association reflects the field or tries to express the field, it's a challenge for the association. So those are the two that come to my mind. There may be others, but those are the two that come to my mind.
Thank you, Professor de Bruyn. It was an honor, and of course was a pleasure to me to have hosted this interview. I'm sure that your experience will be an inspiration for the new generation of patristic scholars. I feel a responsibility also myself now. I have listened to you. Thank you so much for all your effort, for all your work in our association, and also for thank you for be here today with us in our YouTube channel. Greeting, Professor, and greeting to everyone watching this interview, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Fernando. It was a pleasure speaking with you.